Hey, so let's continue with we're talking about belief, faith, behavior, belonging. This is second quadrant stuff. Just a few examples I want to get to would be remember knowledge is the 16th quadrant. Everything is everything comes precedes knowledge, and therefore knowledge kind of encompasses everything before it. Knowledge is sex. So if you think about it, sex, people say sex runs the world. A lot of these great authors, a lot of great men, quote unquote, a lot of great women, were apparently very sexual, but at the same time, they might channel their sex into other pursuits. So they sublimate it into other things. But the idea is knowledge is a 16 quadrant. Everything and knowledge is sex, according to the Bible. To know something is to have sex with somebody. To know somebody is to have sex with them. And then also we talked about how knowledge is related to alcohol and drugs. So to truly know something, we talked about how knowledge, how alcohol is related to sex because in the Bible they say that Adam and Eve ate of the fruit. Well, the fruit apparently was alcohol. Some rabbis say, and that led them to have sex, right? Led Eve to have sex with Satan. And the idea with that is that's trying to make things happen. That's going into the ego body. That's what sex is. But also sex also represents the desire to transcend the ego body, to become one with somebody else. But also the idea with drugs is it can take you out of your ego body self, and that's the idea of the fourth quadrant. It's the death of the ego body self. And if you think about it, think about like ecstasy or DMT. They say it's like a death. Ecstasy actually literally means self transcendence. It's breaking you out of yourself. It's changing the chemicals in your brain to induce a kind of death-like state, so you can see things as they really are outside of the constraints of your ego body. Um, or at least see something in a completely different manner, which in normal conditions would be impossible. And maybe that's why when I was so stressed, I was so good at writing my raps because I was maybe somehow breaking free of my ego body, and I was in touch with maybe the truth, the higher harmony of existence. And if you think about like some of these great authors like Poe, Poe was an alcoholic, or Pollock. Poe was a great writer and he was an alcoholic, or Pollock, he was an alcoholic and he was a great painter. It doesn't mean that alcohol makes you a great artist, but in some of these cases, maybe the drug helped induce in them some sort of transcendent state where they let go of their impulses, they let go of their rigidity and their inhibitions, and they can let go, and then they can produce something that normally in a normal state they wouldn't be able to produce. So, for instance, Pollock, some people argue that in his paintings you could see kind of a fractal pattern, but did he intentionally do that? Not necessarily. Maybe these artists, and I would say so for myself too, when I wrote my raps, they're in touch with some sort of higher dimension that's outside of the self, outside of the rational. The rational is thinking, emotion, doing, dreaming. Now we're getting the fourth quadrant, the flowing, knowing, and this is the death of the self, and we're getting into the divine state, the being, the truth. Um, so let me explain some of this in terms of, again, let's look at some mythology. We have the god of wine in Greek mythology, Dionysus, and Dionysus is kind of this god of ecstasy, but he's related to the drinking of wine. And again, wine can have a dual paradoxical nature. Wine can bring you into the ego body self. Any type of food, even sex, food, anything, any type of drug can confirm the ego body self by you're putting something into your body, and also it can even uh, entrench you into the ego body. For instance, it doesn't always free you of your it can free you of your inhibitions, but then also it can get you caught up in dangerous activities like killing and stuff, which are related to having a narrow, restricted ego consciousness, things that you wouldn't normally do. So, but at the same time, it can free you. But the idea with Dionysus is these people they're worshiping Dionysus, and they're in some sort of ecstasy. They're trying to break free of their ego body selves. And then in the Greek mythology, there's a kind of relationship or a kind of dynamic antagonism between the worship of Dionysus and the worship of Artemis. Where the worship of Artemis is the god, she's a goddess of chastity, and there's a woman who's worshiping Artemis, uh, and and chastity means not having sex. And people who would worship Dionysus, they would have orgies. So which one is better? Again, this is that Shiva versus Vishnu. Both of them can have their limitations, and both of them can induce a kind of self transcendence and get you into the fourth quadrant. So, for instance, like the sex orgies with the alcohol, with the drugs and stuff, that would be like the Shiva worshippers. Again, that can be very self confirmatory, and it can be very people can get enslaved into that, and it can be hard to break free of that. But at the same time, even Jesus says, either be hot or cold, don't be lukewarm. And the idea behind like the sex orgies and the crazy acting crazy is, one, it can get you in trouble, and then you could recognize the limitations of that, and then you can break free of those that dualistic mode of being where you're really confirming the separate ego body self through very restricted consciousness, sex, orgies, stuff that's really indulging the senses, and the senses are related to the ego body self. But at the same time, we don't want to judge it. So it's like, the people in the churches who are speaking in tongues, they can be actually in an induced state where they're transcending their body speaking in tongues, or they could be doing it just to show off, or to be emotionalist, and they could be calling attention to the ego body self. Sentimentalist, calling attention to the ego body self. So these paradoxical aspects of this stuff. But somebody can be in a sex orgy and doing these drugs, and he can taste the experience of self transcendence to God. He can become one with being. And so you don't want to judge it. Somebody can really raise their level of aliveness to a super high level, and he can really lose himself. Um, the irony is, he's probably, somebody who takes drugs, they might lose themselves and they might experience the truth, but then when they come back, they might not have been prepared for it. And there's that saying, angels rush in where fools, or fools rush in where angels fear to tread. If you taste the truth too soon before you're prepared for it, you might reincorporate it into a narrow framework, or a lower, more less advanced dualistic mode of consciousness, and you might be worse off than if you wouldn't have done that drug. So you might have this transcendent experience, but now you might think that if you're still stuck within dualistic consciousness, you might now think you're superior for it, and you might think you're really special, and you might think that you have some enormous insight, and you might start trying to share it, but really it doesn't make sense to people. But you're very arrogant, and you think that you've discovered something super fantastic that nobody else has ever experienced. And now you actually, instead of being transcendent of your ego body self, you've actually become more constricted within your ego body self. And now you might have quote unquote schizophrenia or something like that. And you might think you're the Messiah. And now you're really attached to ego body identities. Now I'm the Messiah. Now I'm super special. And you're broken free from the notion that everything is one, and that there is no thing, and that you don't even exist, and that's a transpersonal consciousness. So that's the paradox of this all. So yeah, these drugs and stuff, they can induce these super numinous experiences, but at the same time, if you're not prepared for it, you can it can be destructive for your maturation and the stability of your ego structure. And to have a stable ego structure is important, so you can transcend, so you can catapult from it. Whereas if you get a fractured ego structure from experiencing something that's too transcendent before you're prepared, then you might come back with a very fractured ego structure. And it's hard to break free of that, because now you're in schizophrenia, and you lack freedom completely, because you're completely caught up in your delusions. You're holding so rigidly to your belief systems, you're having a hard time breaking free of your rigid belief systems to see the truth. Because again, belief isn't the truth. Your belief systems are things that hold together and glue together your ego. And to experience, to be one with the truth, you have to be free, have the capacity to be liberated from those beliefs, those belief systems that you cling to, so that you can be free of that mode of experience to, or experience-based consciousness, from the ego body senses to the truth, which is a transcendence of the ego body, transcendence of beliefs to oneness, to pure truth, what reality truly is, as opposed to what you want it to be, which would be your belief systems, which would be the second quadrant. So there's the Dionysus worshippers, and we don't want to judge them. And so you have this story of Perseus, where Perseus is a Greek, and he's against the Dionysus worshippers, and he wants them to stop, because he sees all these women having these orgies. And he has a spiritual aspiration behind that, because he recognizes, hey, that could be self-indulgence, and sense indulgence. That's calling attention to the ego body, and the ego body is an illusion. And this can be destructive for these people. So he wants to liberate them from that. So he tries to ban Dionysus worship. But then in trying to ban it, he ends up getting killed because he bans it. But then Dionysus comes and then brings them to the Dionysus worshippers, and then they tear him apart. Even his mom and his sister tear him apart while they're having a sex orgy. Now the idea behind that is you don't want to judge, again, because these people are following the left-hand path of truth. There's the right-hand path, which is the Vishnu worship, and there's the left-hand path, which is the Shiva worship. And again, yeah, they're probably in dualistic ego consciousness for sure, but at the same time, you don't want to judge. They can, the rain falls on the just and the unjust according to the Bible. People who are following the left-handed path can be saved, and people who are following the right-handed path may not be saved. And Perseus was following the right-handed path. He was rigid. He wanted to make everybody conform, but conformity is not the flow. Like I said, when you're playing basketball and you're conforming to what the coach says, you're not going to be that good. But if you're rebelling and doing the left-handed path, you're not going to be that good either. If you're just doing whatever you want, but if you're in the flow, now you're doing everything perfect. You're one with what is perfect, with the truth. Now Perseus, so he has a higher aspiration in trying to stop this Dionysus worship, but what ends up happening is they end up tearing him apart, and that's the idea that, yeah, he might have wanted to stop it, but he was probably in dualistic ego consciousness, and he's in that Vishnu worship ideology, the rigid ideology, and that's not the flow. And to try to enforce, to try to impose the law on people, this law that you can't do this worship, you can't drink alcohol. That's kind of like rigid Islam or rigid Christianity. That doesn't really necessarily help, because there can be ego motivations behind the law, and also, again, the law isn't the flow, and that's what Jesus says he came to fulfill the law. Now, yeah, we have to understand that there's also dangers in Dionysus worship and excessive alcohol and drugs and sex orgies and stuff, but at the same time, to try to enforce it, try to impose laws and stuff, might not be the answer. So we're seeing this within the Greek mythology, and then what's fascinating is Perseus, his great grandson is actually Oedipus, and Oedipus ends up killing his dad and having sex with his mom, but then after that, Oedipus pulls out his eyes, which represents him breaking free of his ego body sense experience toward the flow. He's breaking free of the ego body, the sense experience of the body, and then when he's in the flow, he ends up going to another place, and they make him into a god, and that's what the flow is. That's oneness with God. So Perseus, he might have screwed up a little bit in trying to make things happen, trying to stop the Dionysus worship, but at the same time, there was that higher aspiration in his grandson ends up becoming a god. He ends up becoming one with the flow. So we don't want to judge Perseus for when he did this. And then the same thing. But then we have we have the Artemis worship. So we have Artemis worshippers, and they're very rigid. They're like the Vishnu worshippers, and they're not allowed to have sex at all. And because Artemis is a goddess of chastity, and chastity means not having sex. But again, that's a formula. So we have the people who are the Dionysus worshippers. That's a formula. Well, we saw there that they killed their own son. The mother and the sister kill Perseus. There's dangers with Dionysus worship, although we don't want to judge it again, because that's the ego body. When you look down upon people to try to lift yourself up, you can discern. There's a difference between judgment and discerning. When you discern, okay, there can be that can be limiting doing the Dionysus worship. People can get trapped in that mode of consciousness, and can be difficult to break out of. People can become addicted to alcohol. People can become addicted to drugs and stuff, and when that happens, it can become kind of imprisoning. So you can discern that, but to judge it and try to enforce no alcohol, no Dionysus worship, that might not be the most effective way. Another idea with trying to enforce this stuff is then, we see the paradox of you try to ban drugs, and people, it might titillate people. They might now even want the drugs even more because it's something that's inaccessible. So you have to be discerning with type of policies you enforce. But then with the idea with the Artemis worshippers, they're not having sex at all. They're very chaste. They're not drinking alcohol at all. But then there's a woman within the Artemis worshippers, and she ends up having sex. And Artemis gets upset, and she's going to kill this woman But then Zeus comes and saves the woman. And then Zeus used to have Artemis at his right hand side, but then Zeus makes uh, Dionysus his right hand, puts Dionysus on his right hand side instead of Artemis. And this might be the idea that, yes, the Vishnu way of worship, that kind of rigid way of worshiping, the rigid conservative Christian, the rigid conservative Islam, that can be effective. But at the same time, it's not necessarily the flow, especially if you're doing it for ego motivations. Let's say you're doing it because you want to show off, or you're doing it because you want to be saved. You're still stuck in the ego body. You're still focused on the salvation of the ego self, and you haven't transcended the ego body self, the interpersonal consciousness, the idea that there are separate things, toward the transpersonal, to the oneness consciousness, to the truth consciousness. So that's what happens with this Artemis worshiper. She's very chaste. She's not having sex, but then she ends up having sex, and then Artemis wants to kill her, but then Zeus saves her. Zeus is like Indra. He's the sky god. He's a god of clouds, and you want to transcend even the worship of Zeus. But he saves this woman because it's the idea that this formula, the formula of Dionysus worship isn't necessarily the right way, or the formula of Artemis worship isn't necessarily the right way. But actually, we don't want to look, the common thing is to look down upon Dionysus worship and say that's evil, that's bad. But Zeus puts Dionysus next to him, and that's the idea that there isn't any one formula, and rigidity definitely is not the flow. And we don't want to look down upon Dionysus worship. We don't want to look down upon the Shiva worshippers who are engaging in quote unquote sin, because they actually might be closer to the flow than somebody who's a rigid Vishnu worshiper or Artemis worshiper, and who's stuck within the ego self and is doing it as a form of self-righteousness, and he hasn't and because he has so much social approbation for his rigid form of being, he's not getting any incentive to move past that toward the flow. He's lukewarm. He's within conformity consciousness, just trying to do what the coach says, as opposed to transcending what the coach says to what is perfect, to the flow. So this isn't an endorsement of sin, not at all. But it's the idea that we recognize that self-righteousness can be a facade. And that's what was with the Artemis worshippers. They had a formula. Okay, if we don't have sex, then we're going to go to heaven. And as Paul says, I recommend that you guys don't have sex at all. And the reason why he says that is because sex can be self-confirmatory. And the idea is the ego body self keeps you from the truth with that there is no ego body, the transpersonal form of consciousness, the oneness consciousness, the truth consciousness, the flow. But at the same time, Paul says salvation doesn't come through works, but through grace. So you can be rigid and puritanical and quote unquote prude, and you won't be necessarily be in the flow, especially if you're judgmental and you're looking down upon people. Maybe you have incentives. Maybe you're a white supremacist, and you're looking down upon the rappers, and you don't recognize, okay, the rappers are talking about having sex and drugs and stuff, not because they're black, but because they're growing up in the ghetto, and also they've had this, or they've accepted this label of black, and they've been, and this has been a social construction in order to maintain the status quo, and they've internalized negative stereotypes. But at the same time, they might be those Dionysus worshiper black people, quote unquote. They're not really black, but the people who you label black, they might be closer to the flow than a puritanical John Wayne evangelical Christian. Or they both might not be. They're both not in the flow. They're both in the dualistic ego consciousness, interpersonal consciousness. They're both not in the transpersonal. But who's closer? Maybe the rapper, because he might get himself in trouble faster. Whereas the puritanical evangelical might stay stuck in that mode of consciousness and never have any incentive or any impetus pushing him out of that. And that's the idea, you don't want to judge, and you see that throughout the Bible, saying not to judge. And you saw that with David's wife. David was dancing, and his testicles were showing, and because he lost it, he was in the flow, And then his wife got mad at him, and she wanted him to be prude, and she was like, hey, you're dancing in front of these women and stuff. But then the wife became barren because David was in the flow. And this is the idea, you don't want to stifle that. You don't want to stifle that. You want to let people be free. But at the same time, we know there's limitations, and people can get caught up in destructive modes of being that are very dualistic. It's even impersonal modes of being, which are maybe just sexual sense indulgence and killing and raping and stuff like that. Of course, that can be very, very, very constrictive consciousness. It could be difficult to break free of that type of consciousness. But at the same time, it's not necessarily much different than somebody who's a puritanical evangelical, who's also within a very narrow dualistic frame of consciousness, holding on to rigid belief systems. They're both holding on to ego body identity in a lot of cases, and not necessarily in the flow. But we don't want to judge either one, again, because when you're judging, judgment is attitudinal and it's emotional, and that's calling attention to your ego body. You're putting down people. It's like Tommy Lauren, she's constantly judging people. I'm not judging her, but you see that I'm discerning that, when she speaks a lot of times, she'll put on an angry face and she'll call people names, name calling, and what this does is this dualistic consciousness is calling attention to your ego body self. Also, like Tucker Carlson was like that a lot, or just like any of the Fox News types of people, very judgmental, holding on to rigid belief systems. And again, I don't want to judge them. Everybody serves their role. There's liberals, there's conservatives, everybody's serving their role within the system. But and they're not necessarily bad. So I'll give another example of that. I remember I went to a Yogananda place, and there was this guy who was one of those reptilian. He believed in the reptilian conspiracy theories, and I don't want to judge him and be like, okay, this guy's a white supremacist because the reptilian conspiracy theorists are white supremacists, and the way he talked, he was saying like, oh yeah, the reason why white people are rich is because the reptilians were on their side and stuff, and I don't want to judge him because maybe he's right. I don't know, but the thing is, he's holding on to a rigid belief system. But at the same time, though, what he's doing is he's breaking free of the conservative Christian rigid belief system, at least, and now he's acknowledging perhaps reptilians and stuff. So he's breaking out of one belief system conformity box, which is a step in the right direction, because any belief system is limiting, and it's not the flow. Because when you're stuck in a belief system, now you can't see the truth because you're holding on to that belief system. But at the same time, if he's now holding on to a new belief system, okay, reptilians and supernatural, things like that, okay, maybe he's right, but at the same time, it's still a belief system. And if he's holding on too rigidly, then he might get stuck within that matrix framework, and then he won't be able to see the truth through the flow, through the transcendence of the ego, body, interpersonal consciousness, to the transpersonal consciousness, to the truth consciousness. So I'll give one more example with that. Let's look at the story of Parashurama, and how you can look at the story of Parashurama through two perspectives. There's this one story of Parashurama. Parashurama is the avatar of Vishnu, one of the avatars of Vishnu, and he's an axe wielder. And in this story, Parashurama's mom goes out to the forest, and she represents a goddess. And remember, the goddesses represents more interpersonal consciousness. They're earth goddesses, so they represent the earth, and the earth is material. Whereas the gods, like the sky god, Indra, is moving more towards transpersonal because it's more ethereal and it's moving away from the material. So it's moving more towards transpersonal, and that's why the gods tend to be seen higher as the demons, because the demons are related more with the earth and materialism, whereas the gods are related more with the sky and the transpersonal consciousness, transcending material, interpersonal to the transpersonal. But at the same time, you don't want to worship the sky gods either, because they're also still material. They're not the true truth. They're not the flow, which is Vishnu, Shiva, oneness consciousness. They're still limited. They're still finite. The clouds are still finite, even though they represent something that's transcendental because they're less physical. They're still finite. And the idea behind why, again, physical isn't bad, but the idea is physical is an illusion. There is no thing. And anything that's physical gives you the impression that there's a separate thing. And that gives you the impression that there's a separate thing and there's a separate you. So you still hold on to the ego, interpersonal, dualistic consciousness that you are a separate thing, dualism. But there is no thing. That's the idea with transpersonal consciousness. That's when you get in the flow, when you lose yourself. There is no more self. But that's a true consciousness. That's not a memorized belief system, because if it's a belief system, you're still within the ego body self. A belief is still holding together and gluing together the ego body self. And if you're latched onto that, then you're not really in the transpersonal consciousness, no matter what that belief is. So the idea with Parashurama is Parashurama's mom, she represents the earth goddess, and she goes out to the forest and she is sifting some water. But the idea was if she ever had an impure thought, she wouldn't be able to sift the water. And there were fairies in there, and they gave her a sexual impure thought. So when she returns, the husband sees this because she couldn't gather the water because the water carrier dissolved because of her impure thought. So then the dad tells Parashurama, cut off your mom's head. So Parashurama gets his axe, cuts off his mom's head. Now, a liberal is going to look at this story and he's going to say, wow, that is patriarchal society killing women. The idea that we have to subjugate women and stuff and that they can't have sexual thoughts. This is old ancient belief systems written by patriarchal men who ran society and were trying to dominate women so they could spread their genes more and make sure that their women don't have sex with other men so they can ensure that their genes were being spread and stuff. And this is sick. We need to get rid of these belief systems. Now, a conservative Hindu might say, yes, this is right. Women are inferior. They should not be having sexual thoughts. But does that really help? Again, because now they're still in the ego consciousness. And if you're telling women, yeah, you can't have sexual thoughts and stuff, that's not going to make them not have sexual thoughts. That's not upgrading their consciousness. Now they might even be more inclined to have sexual thoughts because they're still stuck within their ego body. And they feel like they're being oppressed and marginalized. And yeah, they might try to stop having sexual thoughts, but it's not going to help necessarily. They don't have any transcendent consciousness, or that's not really the flow. If you're trying to repress, that's not the flow. But yeah, but a conservative might look at this and be, yeah, repress women, suppress them, subjugate them, which might not necessarily help. And it's confirming the illusion that there's men and women, that there's separation, ego, body, self, that women are inferior, when really there's men who are certain ways, there's women there's certain ways. This is a very simplistic model of reality, but this is the kind of rigid belief system that a religious conservative might hold on to in order to glue together his fragile ego self. But now the transpersonal interpretation is, this isn't about men, women, any of that. This is the idea of any sexual, just any impure thought, any thought period is from the ego. And you want to transcend thoughts to inspiration, to the truth, which is contemplation, passion, flowing, knowing, the fourth quadrant. Transcend the ego body. Thoughts are a part of the ego body. They're neurotransmitters in the brain, activity. And they're a lot shaped by your ego identity. And she had an impure thought representing that she's still trapped in the ego identity. She's still in dualistic consciousness. She thinks she's a separate self, and she's titillated by these fairies and stuff. And she's not in the transcendental realm. The idea with the transcendental realm is you don't ignore it. You don't ignore the fairies. You don't hate the fairies. The sirens. You don't. Because if you ignore them, you're still focusing on them. But you don't hate them, but you also don't indulge in them. But you transcend them. You're free. It's like when you're playing basketball and there's no distractions when you're in the flow. And the fans can be cheering and yelling and screaming obscenities at you, but you're not even aware of it because you're so focused. You lost yourself. And that's what Parashurama cutting off his mom's head represents. Cutting off the thinking. Let go of the thinking so you can transcend the dualistic consciousness to the flow, to the oneness consciousness. That's a transcendence. That's the flow. One more example of that would be like Yogananda, who was a guru, a Hindu guru, who kind of integrated Hinduism and Christianity. He said that God is, you get oneness with God in between breaths. So in between the inhale and exhale, in the intermediate state between breaths. So this part, that middle state, the transitional state between inhale and exhale. That's where God is experienced. And again, it's kind of an oxymoron to say God experienced, because experience is based on the ego body senses, but God is a transcendence of the ego body senses. So we're acknowledging the limitations of language here. But the idea behind that is, in that intermediate state of the breath, that's the state that you let go. That is the ego body letting go. And so long as you're holding on, so long as you're within the ego body, you are experiencing reality, and any experience is not reality itself, because it's being contaminated by the ego body. But that intermediate state between breaths, that's the letting go state, and that's that movement from thinking orientation, the third quadrant, the ego body orientation, moving past the dreaming orientation where we're getting into the transcendental state. That's the fourth quadrant of the third quadrant, toward the flow, toward the oneness consciousness, toward the transcendence of the ego body self. And that's why Yogananda said that. All right, that should be good for now.